right, perfect. Good. Okay. Maybe we can give it a maybe another 30 seconds. I think we're bringing people from the waiting room, which is great. And we can give it another few minutes for people to join. Should be great. All right. I love it. I'm also seeing people's the thing I like about Zoom is you can always see, even though people have joined, you can see, all right, this person's audio is still connecting. So it gives you a little bit more capacity to be respectful for for people's ability to hear what we're saying. So give it a few more minutes. Looks like we've got a couple connections in progress. Okay. All right. So one check mark and then give it another 10 seconds and then we'll dive into this thing. I want to give as much time as we have so that we can save room for questions and answers. Okay. All right, perfect. All right, well, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So first off, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're gonna give it a few. We gave it a few minutes. I think we've got some people joining. I think as I'm going through this introduction piece, we're gonna see some more people joining, which should be nice. Um, so I want to say just thank you for joining our 1 hour virtual Meet the Candidate session with Portland City Commissioner Rene Gonzalez, the candidate for the mayor of Portland, which is a big title. I love that, a lot of responsibility. So please join me in welcoming Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you all for having me.
Awesome. I'm going to be the moderator for this session. My name is Julian Thomas. I'm on the Impact Northwest Advocacy Committee. I've got a background in management consulting, and I'm currently working for Ride Connection. They support non-emergency medical transportation for the Tri-County area. So this session is hosted by a number of Portland area nonprofits doing great work in the community. A special thank you to Portland Tenants United, Blanchard House, SEI, Northwest Pilot Project, Path Home, Transition Projects, Our Just Future, William Temple House, the Welcome Home Coalition, and of course, Impact Northwest. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we do not endorse any candidate. We do feel that civic engagement and advocating for communities where we work is very important. All right, so we'll switch over to the mission slide. Perfect. A little bit about Impact Northwest, just from a background standpoint. Our mission is to prevent homelessness. Impact Northwest is the largest organization in the region dedicated to keeping people housed so that they don't end up on the streets. Impact Northwest serves around 27,000 people each year with services that help them stay housed and thrive. They do this in two ways. One, provide stabilizing services so people remain in their homes, such as rental and energy assistance, and by providing strengthening services for people by offering upstream support such as academic enrichment, job readiness, and connections. Impact Northwest knows that services alone won't solve our housing crisis, but advocacy will. So we have a two-pronged advocacy approach. My colleagues can add a link in the chat about our homelessness prevention strategy that gives more information about that. And together with our partners, we want to stress the importance of housing plus services as a solution to address the housing crisis and contract modernization that revamps the way that the public sector contracts with nonprofits and provides housing services. And with that, let's set the scene with some ground rules before we go ahead and get started. So, we're in as you know, we're in a time, we're getting really close to election time. I'm sure a lot of people might have already voted. I've got my mail-in ballot sitting right next to me. But because this is emotions can run a little higher during this time of year. We want to really, really reinforce some of these ground rules that, number one, we want to treat everybody with respect. And we want to make sure that all participants are treating others with respect. We have the power to mute people, so we want to make sure that we're muted unless we're invited to unmute. During the Q&A session, please use the chat for questions. There is an option to raise your hand. So if you're not used to the Zoom functionality, it's as simple as clicking, there should be a heart react button at the very on your screen. And if you click it, one of the options on there will be to raise hand. And you can raise your hand, you can lower your hand. If I call on you and your hand's still raised, I might click on the lower button. I have that power now, which is amazing. But raising hands makes it much easier to call on people because the program actually tells us who raised their hands first, which is really nice. Also, if you can't already see, the session is being recorded, which means that anyone that isn't in the session, or if anyone would like to share the session afterwards, you'll have that ability. It'd be great. All right, so the next step is we are going to give Commissioner Gonzalez up to 20 minutes to speak. The remaining time will be open up for questions to the audience in the meeting. With that, I'd love to welcome Commissioner Gonzalez. Thank you for joining us today. And I'll put 20 minutes on the clock. Go ahead.
Well, thank you all for hosting me today, Impact Northwest and the whole team. I don't think I'm going to use 20 minutes. I would love to get into Q&As relatively quickly, but I'll give you a little bit of my backgrounds, what I've seen in my time as city commissioner, and then a view of the city, including our preventative steps and responses to homelessness tied to broader issues as to where I see the city going. By way of background, I'm a fifth-generation Portlander, father of three, lifelong Democrat, and in many respects, a ordinary Portlander in the private sector until sometime in 2020. Became increasingly concerned about the direction of the city and our response to a number of really fundamental challenges to livability and safety in the city of Portland. So ran for office in 2022, won, and now a candidate for mayor. Because I talked a lot about public safety and was very focused on the campaign, the Mayor Wheeler assigned me the public safety bureaus in beginning of 2023. And it is certainly informed much of my view of both prevention and then the response to homelessness and the sort of auxiliary issues that come with it. Emergency management, BOAC, which is 911, and Portland Fire are the three primary public safety bureaus in the city of Portland. And each of them intersect with families on the margins in our homeless population in different ways. I'll get into some of the particulars in a second. Obviously, in my time on city council, I have been very public safety oriented, even beyond the bureaus I've managed. In many ways, I've been the standard bearer for what many would call safety and livability, took on outdoor drug use, took on some of the things that were well-intentioned, but maybe having negative effects on the streets of Portland in terms of how we respond to our difficult issues of the unsanctioned houseless. And I do want to emphasize what wonderful work you all do in preventing homelessness, because when we get to the point of our interactions with the unsheltered on the streets of Portland, I think, as you very well know, every week, every month someone spends on the streets of Portland is makes it that much harder to get them back into a stabilized life and existence. And so just to, on this point, in Portland Fire, that is truly your first responder to medical emergencies in the city of Portland. It is often the first on arrival within 8 minutes. Substantial volume in the unsheltered houseless population. Roughly 40% of call volume comes from encampments. And we've made a number of significant innovations in my time overseeing Portland Fire and how we respond to that space. We rolled out, in conjunction with Central City Concern and Multnomah County, a phenonorphine pilot. And this is really when someone develops opioid substance use disorder, consuming high levels of fentanyl. It's to assist in the pathway to recovery. So blocking some of the more painful aspects of withdrawal. And liking that, I think we're we may be the first city in the country to do that at the street level, where you don't have to go into a clinical environment every time. And seeing some positive steps with that. Again, I don't want to understate how difficult it is once someone is addicted to fentanyl. I don't know that we have collectively a national or even international clear pathway on what recovery looks like. It is a rough path, no matter what. Once someone is at the street level consuming fentanyl, but like what we're seeing with that pilot. Secondly, we changed how we respond to overdoses in the city of Portland. Narcan is somewhat successful with fentanyl and is widely distributed. So we moved from a 4-person fire truck with ambulance and police officer to often a 2-person rig that can administer Narcan. And ideally we get them in the phenonorphine pilot at that point. But just that's a rationalizing of our existing medical response system. And I think your unique perspective in preventing homelessness gives you insights that many others don't in our community. But one of the most painful aspects is the incredible amount of resources that are absorbed in less than 1% of our population once they become unsheltered. That is it's just the reality. And I recently did a ride along with Portland Police on their deflection system program to see what mobile deflection looks like, and the tremendous medical challenges that someone on the street has to get back to kind of a stabilized reality it's heartbreaking in many respects. And I think we have to look with clear eyes as to how far that path is once they're there. Not only are you dealing with opioid addiction, you're often seeing other physical ailments from sleeping outside for an extended period of time while consuming high levels of opioids, open sores, sometimes losing limbs because of infections just from inactivity. And it is and I'll circle back to that, but again, that's why it's so important that we prevent homelessness. It's why it's so important that we invest in behavioral health in a system that is doing everything we can to prevent people from getting on the streets, because the cost and absorption of resources that occurs by that small percentage that's once they're on the streets is heartbreaking, difficult, and not black and white solutions on how to get out of it. One, I will say though, I have been one of the biggest supporters on City Council for both task sites and safe rest villages, combining shelter with services. I think that's the only path out for us. It's not cheap shelter or services. It's got to be the combination of two. When you're talking about that initial intervention, getting them off the street into a more stabilized place before we get them back into housing. I like our push through there. We're getting higher acceptance rate of shelter offerings when it's going to task site or safe rest villages. We're getting better push through in the supportive housing than we ever saw with congregate shelter. So when, and I think your folks truly appreciate a systemic view of homelessness, and both the prevention and then what it takes to get people out. I think that continues to have to be the view we apply. It's just not going to be one piece that gets folks out, much less on the prevention side. Certainly, my time on city council and particularly overseeing emergency management has given me insights into how you prop up an emergency shelter. You know, when it gets hot or cold, Multnomah County declares an emergency. They're still they became increasingly reliant on the city of Portland during the pandemic to fill capacity where they can't stand up sufficient shelter on their own. That provides all the insights anyone would want to the challenges of any kind of congregate or other shelter, whether on an emergency basis or under a long term. You have to deal with all the security, procuring facilities, how you retain facilities for more than one night, because when you're relying on some of what we do in emergency management, it's only available for one night or a couple. It's very hard to extend that over number of days. The staffing model gets very, very complicated when you're dependent on volunteers. You can get them to show up one night, very hard to get them to show up a second night, almost impossible to get them to show up night 3 or 4 when you're talking volunteers. So needless to say, it's not a particularly stable system. It works okay in emergencies, but I think longer view of that, at least from my vantage point after being up close to it, is that we have to rely on professional staff, not volunteers, as much as we can, in clear designated spaces. Again, I'm talking a lot about what we do with people already on the street. I fully recognize that your folks do a great job of preventing more from getting there, but it just I think it's important that we all level set on the profound challenges once people are already there, in the various ways we have to intersect as a system with folks at that point. Love to talk about more about what I learned in public safety in the Q&As if you'd like. Maybe transition a little bit to what I really envisioned for the city of Portland. You know, first and foremost, you know, this used to be one of the safest, cleanest, healthiest cities in America, and that's really how I'm orienting the future of the city. Getting back to those core components. Yes, that's well-supported public safety. That's a given, but it goes deeper. The ability to have family wage jobs and stable housing, that we are filling the gaps in the social network, social services best we can, that we're out on the front end, is so essential. And I have been very, very focused on centering policy decisions on families so that they can thrive in the city of Portland, elders so that they can age in place, and then further creators and builders. We put a lot on ourselves as Portlanders. We often want to solve climate change and address big national and international issues, but which is all fine. I mean, that's we have a responsibility as citizens of the globe, but I really want our local government focused on Portlanders, and that means asking the question every single day: can families grow in the city of Portland? Can they thrive? Can elders enjoy their final years in the city of Portland? Everything from housing stability to happiness in its most basic level. There are some other components in my vision for the city of Portland that may be more or less germane to your audience, but I'll just emphasize a few. I'm a big believer in large capital projects. I think they generate not just family wage jobs, but a lot of economic opportunity. They recreate the social effervescence. They reestablish a lot of the social fabric that was disrupted during the pandemic. And getting back to that word joy and happy, as a community, that's something that I really want to orient our city towards. And that does not mean abandoning the day-to-day blocking and tackling, sometimes grinding work of keeping people safe, keeping the city clean, supporting them where there are gaps. But it's also thinking big as a city and holding our hands and working towards a common future. And that may mean baseball on the waterfront, or future performing arts that truly brings joy to all of Portlanders. But there's some really exciting projects coming down in the city of Portland that I think create space for us all to have a positive future that we can point to. Love to talk about housing policy as well, maybe in the Q&As. do want to emphasize a couple of points there that we're massively underproducing housing. And when you look at the broader needs of certain segments of our population, we're doing okay, not great, but okay on federally subsidized housing. But obviously other areas of on the income continuum, we're really failing to produce. We're not producing middle income housing at anywhere near the numbers we need to. We know that puts pressure both at those in the middle and in some ways pressure on those lower in the income scale. And my focus is really trying to decrease the cost of construction for both for-profit and nonprofit developers in the city of Portland. We know, for example, our SDCs in combination with infrastructure costs are often backbreaking, and really want to look at ways to give credits for if you're spending $100,000 on infrastructure investments as a part of your project, that you get offsets on system development charges. Secondly, the time frame for permits to get through. In general, I want us to meet state standards of 120 days. I also like Commissioner Rubio's suggestion that we focus on 90 days for approved housing projects. I think that's a good idea. Again, happy to get into more particulars on housing production, but I'll leave it at that. Look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Rene, for sharing that with us. And this would be a great time to open it up for questions and answers. So just want to give a quick reminder of the ground rules again. We want to make sure that we're showing respect to everyone. And I can see most of you, so all on my screen across. So if you raise your hand, clicking the gesture, that works. If you raise your hand just using your normal hand, I might also see that as well. So and you can also put questions in the chat as well, and we will go ahead and unmute you if your hand's raised, so we can hear your question. Okay, so feel free to open it up, and we can start that process. All right, I see Andy, go for it.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Julian. Appreciate it. Thanks for hosting today. Good to see everybody. I'm Andy Nelson, Executive Director at Impact Northwest. Glad you're all here. Thank you, Commissioner, for joining us. So I want to kick it off with a question about how the city contracts with nonprofit service providers, many of whom are on the call. In fact, a lot of us were at a hearing this morning at Multnomah County that brought up just the topic, and really examining, we talked about the history of contracting between the public sector and the nonprofit sector. Regardless of what path we take, the fact remains that we're underfunding the frontline workers we're asking to do the work. You mentioned before, this is serious work. We can't ask volunteers to do it, but the way this system is currently operated is we're putting frontline workers really their own level of housing instability because of the low wages that are paid for. So we're really interested in solving that. And we know it's complex. We know there's many factors to it. We haven't seen a lot of action. I'd just be love to hear your thoughts on how do we close that gap? How do we make sure that the city in particular really starts to honor this idea of a living wage or a housing wage for the folks on the front lines doing the work?
Yeah, I mean, wage growth and stability is so essential for any housing policy and really population retention. And the workforce development needs and stability are very, very crucial. I'm going to start with a level of humility in this area. I am aware of the challenges in this space at a high level. I've been on the steering committee for the Homeless Response Action Plan for a few months, and in my time on City Council have been privy to some of the dialogues about the gap here. But my bureaus, for the most part, didn't directly interact with most of the contractors in the space. So I just want to level set that with some degree of humility, recognizing the problem, that I may not have complete expertise on the solution in this space. But some of the things that I would emphasize, I think the length of contracts can be a challenge. It doesn't address per se the pay per person, but the how long we contract with contractors, I think, can be an area of greater certainty. I am of the opinion that the city should be more involved directly in items that are within the city limits. And so let me take a step further on that. As many of you know, we are currently sending roughly 40 million a year to what was formerly known as the Joint Office on Homelessness. There was some philosophical orientation going back to Charlie Hales as mayor, carried forward Mayor Wheeler, that we would outsource a lot of our efforts, including at times in housing, but primarily in the houseless services area, to the Joint Office on Homelessness. I'm increasingly of the opinion that this doesn't work from a system perspective inside our city limits. I think we need to be much more directly involved in provision of services and the direct contracting in the space. And that's just to assure that there's strong outcomes that tie to the city of Portland's objectives, preventing houselessness, getting people off the street, and also assuring safety in our community. The city of Portland doesn't have a choice but to be involved in that, and it directly impacts how we contract with our providers. But I think that, I pay attention to some of the credits and efforts that have been done at the state level to support people trying to get education in behavioral health. I think there's some good ideas there, but I'm not sure we're seeing the traction yet in terms of supporting, getting the numbers of behavioral health specialists, for example, that want to work in this space. But it's something I pay attention to. Can we further incentivize? I guess one last piece, we do have some efforts to drive home ownership in the city of Portland. I'd really like to expand those, that they're not just targeted on, sometimes they can be too narrow, the recipients, and I'd really like to think about a broader net of who can benefit from some of those city programs, including folks that you're talking about in your workforce. And obviously, if there's something I'm missing, I'd love to hear it, because I'll get back to what I said at the beginning. I'm aware of this issue. I am privy to some of the levers that have been talked about, but I have not been directly involved in the niche of contracts you're referring to.
Okay. The next question we have is, looks like it's from a Betsy, a pre-submitted question. Please explain how you'll stabilize the hundreds, if not thousands of jobs that are employed by community-based organizations doing direct service care work if you cancel the contract with the county and the city funding JOHS.
I'd really like to see the city just for areas that we're going to be responsible for, task sites and safe rest villages, taking a step back. So we're sending approximately 40 million a year. Some years it's a little bit less, but let's just say round number 40 million a year to JOHS. We're essentially getting 40 million back for task sites and safe rest villages. It's almost a wash. In some years, it's going to be 5 to 7 difference either way, just to be candid, because there is fluctuations in how those numbers flow. So I think the first part is, I don't think it's going to destabilize anything with respect to task sites and safe rest villages. And longer term, I think the county and the city, it's going to be a roughly a wash. I'd kind of start with that. I actually think that the current plan under the existing IGA is that task sites and safe rest villages would transfer operationally to the county July 1, 2025. They're currently managed through the city of Portland. I think that increasingly watching what's happening at the ground level, watching the positive relationships between the city and many of its contractors and managing safe rest villages and task sites, I just don't think operationally that transfer makes sense anymore. And my position is sort of, as I've watched it up close, it is gotten there. And so I think in many ways, going down the path that we're considering currently is going to be more stabilizing than unstabilizing. Just keep them at the city level.
Okay. The next question is from Andy Miller for Our Just Future. Can you speak to why you support reducing the TIF set aside for affordable housing production at the very time the city is underproducing housing and we face a huge gap in affordable housing for the families who need it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the affordable housing set aside was really adopted in a couple of steps at a very different time in the city's history. It was a time when we were seeing substantial redevelopment, but a lot of $1 million condos being built, and we weren't creating the space to assure housing being generated across the income levels. What we're seeing right now is no housing development. I mean, there's been essentially the only metrics that we're anywhere close to are actually in federally subsidized housing in the region. I think we're looking at less than 1,000 units total generation this year in the city proper, at least in terms of permits getting through the system. I mean, this is catastrophic in terms of affordability. The market has collapsed. Now, there are factors outside of the city of Portland: interest rates, inflation. Those are pieces that none of us on this call, no policymaker locally, can control directly. And it's not just affecting the city of Portland, that truly is nationally. But even relative to many of our peers, we've seen a collapse in the generation of any housing production. And so when I'm looking at the tools that we have at the city's disposal on how we get out of this, I want to give Prosper more flexibility to get really multiplying projects online. And that's not an abandonment of focusing on housing. That's just giving at a specific TIF district level more flexibility on how best to deploy those dollars to get the most impact, including in overall housing generation. I mean, I alluded to in my opening comments, but I don't know if we can say it enough. The collapse of production of middle income housing in the city, I mean, I can't think of a worse scenario in terms of trying to prevent homelessness, because again, that just pushes everything from that income level down. That increases the cost of housing for everyone and drives housing instability. So that's not a rejection of federally subsidized housing, what I would call affordability with the big A, at all. It's just recognizing that we may need to deploy more dollars into other parts of the housing continuum to get more capacity online.
All right. It does look like Andy also added a link that could be beneficial in understanding the gap, the wage gap. And then the next question is from Mike Tierney. Hi, Commissioner Gonzalez. Thank you for being here with us. How would you evaluate the city-county homelessness response plan released earlier this year? And what would you add or change to make it more effective?
I like quite a bit about it. It's such a comprehensive plan that it's, everyone's going to probably find some things they like in it. I'd say I'm going to speak from a myopic perspective for a second. That is from the city of Portland's perspective, because when we talk about responses to homelessness, there are necessary multiple perspectives on that issue. County is a social services oriented body, is sometimes very focused on the individual. The city of Portland, we have no choice. We are who the public holds responsible for public safety and the right of ways being usable, those with disabilities being able to get to the grocery store or to a walk. And so I would say one gap from the city's perspective is not as clear an articulation of a reduction in the number of unsheltered houseless on the street. It's there around the edges, but in general, the plan is often we'll talk about how many shelter sites we want to create relative to on the street. Their KPIs, many of their metrics are venerable in themselves. They make sense with respect to certain inputs, but the overall output I don't know how our plan cannot be centered on the reduction in the overall number of unsheltered in our region with time. And to me, that's one place where the plan and really how it's articulated is missing. And that's not to say the inputs they're tracking are important. It's just more agreement on that output. I think the other part of the plan that I have increasingly come of the opinion, and I alluded to it earlier, but I just want to really emphasize this, that I think that in urban settings, I don't see how cities can offload, outsource, defer to the county on intervention shelter, like literally the first shelter from someone off the on the street to that initial stabilizing environment. And that's for a whole host of reasons. One is because our citizens expect us to address a reduction in unsheltered homelessness. Two, our legal environment. House Bill 3115, it impacts our ability to actually keep our sidewalks clean, and the availability of shelter is directly tied at times to those two things. Third, our obligations in our settlement to those with disabilities. Cities are held to ADA compliance in ways that often other governmental entities aren't, because we actually are responsible for the right of ways. So we have these obligations explicitly, or just in terms of expectations, to a whole bunch of stakeholders that care very, very directly about a humane treatment to those on the streets, and also assurance that right-of-ways are kept clear and usable for all citizens. And so what does that mean for HRAP? I think that on the one hand, we absolutely have to think as a system. HRAP does a good job of that. It's getting better on metrics subject to the piece I referenced. But at the operational level, I don't think there can be too big a gap between those that are responsible for the immediate intervention, whether that's enforcement or trying to connect folks, and those responsible for the intervening shelter. And I'm not calling it emergency shelter. It's amorphous concept of literally the first place someone goes when they're getting off the street. Whether you want to call it congregate or task sites or safe residence village, that immediate intervention shelter before we get into supportive housing. I think the HRAP largely assumes that the county drive that. I don't know that that's the right answer going forward. I would even take it a step further when we think about outreach, in whether you're talking about supplies for people on the street or stabilizing people right on the edges. That one's I'm a little less clear on, but in some of the conversations, even with the city of Gresham, I think there's broad recognition that cities are going to be held responsible for that space no matter what. So offloading agency to the county may just not be realistic in an urban setting. Rural counties, entirely different ball of wax. What goes on in East County, different story. So it's not that the HRAP gets anything particularly wrong on that. I'm starting to have different assumptions about how important it is for the city to be center in a lot of that intervention.
All right. Thank you for answering that question, Rene. The next question comes from Sahan McKelvey with self-enhancement. This was a public safety question. How would you address racial disparities in police stops and arrests? Specifically, Black residents are stopped and arrested far more frequently than our white counterparts. And this leads to increased distrust in our community. What steps would you take to move towards and rectifying this and building more trust between the police and the Black community?
Yeah, great question. Well, one of the pieces in our response to gun violence and community violence in the city of Portland that I think is a really important intervention over the last couple of years. We saw a huge spike in gun violence post-pandemic, well documented. If you go back 20 years ago, let's be very specific. If there's a shooting in the Black community, right, a homicide in the Black community, you would see massive over policing of neighborhoods as is to get the whoever, find the perp, sometimes to prevent the second shooting. You truly saw saturation of a neighborhood of police. That is no longer the way the city of Portland approaches that issue. So it's a staffing capacity issue, but also the recognition that was leading to over policing, that was leading to bad instances. We're very committed right now, and I'm 100% supportive of focused intervention, which is targeted deterrent. I'm going to be very specific on that. That means that there's a shooting, and it's in roughly, if you go back to 2022 numbers, if there's a gun homicide, it's about 40% chance that it was either a Black perpetuator or a victim. That's just statistically in the city of Portland. It fluctuates from 30 to 40s during that time period. We target for non-police intervention, folks with lived experience to do outreach to the folks that we think may have been secondarily impacted by that shooting. So that might be a relative of the victim. That might be who we think the shooter is. And there's always going to be a criminal justice response when we're talking about the potential perpetuator of it. But there's heavy reliance now on organizations leveraging people with lived experience to do that initial outreach. And even the police response at this time is a designated team. It's not dozens of people in a neighborhood. It is folks that understand how to work with outreach workers to de-escalate and to prevent, and because the biggest homicide at that point is preventing the second or third homicide. I'm really proud of the work that the city's done in that area. And we've seen gun violence reductions, particularly in the Black community, since adoption of that, without over policing and leveraging outside groups. Again, it's literally people that were involved in gangs or prior criminal on their record, and leveraging those populations to help do this intervention. And so I think that's a part of our path forward. And then also worth emphasizing, our police department is becoming more diverse. You look at the younger part of the department, less than 10 years, they're much more ethnically diverse than the older part. I go to as many swearing-ins as I can, and the number of candidates that we are getting from neighborhoods close in, it's city proper, certainly the metro area, but it's just more diverse. I think our last few classes have all been more diverse than the city of Portland is as a whole, and certainly more diverse than the older leadership or police officers have been in the department longer periods of time. So I think we need to continue to do that. There's a lot of efforts, for example, to recruit we're finding a lot of success in recruiting collegiate athletics. For whatever reason, people come from sports environment, they come from an environment where they work as a part of a team, and that's getting some traction in our recruitments. That's not racial specific per se, but it's more about targeted recruitment, including in our neighborhoods, in our local schools, that shortens the delta shortens the chasm between the police and community. The shorter the smaller that chasm, the healthier relationship we have in this space.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I think that was the last question that I'm seeing on the list. I do see, looks like Andy just raised his hand. Go for it, Andy.
Yeah, so Commissioner Gonzalez, thanks for being here with us in this space. First off, on the TIF set aside, I appreciate your response to my question. I just want to emphasize that given the city's historical use of TIF and urban renewal, I think if we don't create sufficient affordable housing in parts of Portland that we are intentionally, if you will, gentrifying, we run the risk of TIF being a tool for what it's been in the past, which is economic and racial resegregation. So that's why I think advocates have strongly supported the set aside specific to that resource. But my question for you really is, we likely have a fair number of areas of ideological disagreement between our sector and your platform, the grants pass decision, the TIF set aside, the city's proposed withdrawal from the joint office. I'm wondering if you're elected mayor, how will you work with our sector across these ideological differences? How do you see our sector as housing developers and human services providers? Do you see us as a potential ally despite these ideological differences, and how will you work with us?
Well, I think it's listening and engaging on our common ground, common goals. I want Portlanders to be in stable living realities, and that's a recognition that we have to build housing that people can afford, regardless of what level of federal or other resources we're bringing in to assure that affordability. But I think there's a lot more in common than sometimes the specific political outlets. I shouldn't even say political, but I would say, I don't know that I get at Boise or House Bill 3115 as a result of a particular ideology. I just think that cities are charged with a certain responsibility, and they have to have the tools to do it, and that it's difficult for a state legislature or a judge far away from the realities to address that issue. I'm not sure that's an ideological framing, but at the end of the day, I think we have a lot of shared interests: keep people in housing, keep them stabilized, and probably a shared assumption about how difficult it is once people are homeless, how difficult the road back can be for certain segments. So I would just emphasize what we have in common. And your sector, as you frame it, has been essential in preventing homelessness, and partnering on how we continue to do that, even if there's going to be some things that we may not 100% agree on.
All right, thank you for answering that, Renee. We've got probably time for maybe one more question, possibly two. I kind of like what Andy did there, from a hey, I asked a question recently. Renee answered it. Let's kind of dig in to see if there are other aspects of the question that I'd like further answers on. Are there any other questions previously asked that anybody would like to kind of clarify or ask more questions on, just to give Renee more of an opportunity to provide an answer? And due to time, feel free to just raise your hand or click the hand emoji. All right, I see a hand from Mike. Go for it.
Thanks, Julian. I will follow up on my question earlier, Commissioner, about the HRAP and your thoughts on it, how it could become more effective. My thought is just maybe expanding that. If you were to get the role of mayor, one thing I liked about what I read in the HRAP early when it was released to the public was the public dashboard.
Yes,
We're
absolutely.
concerned people in roles that we have or just regular public folks that want to know what is going on with probably the biggest issue that the city is facing. And so I've kind of followed along with how the dashboard is being presented. I think it's still in its forming process. It's not exactly what I was hoping for. I guess what I really want to ask is, for you, how you view that dashboard and how you would view your own administration. How would you better communicate with the public, what different platforms maybe that haven't been used, or just thoughts you'd have, so that the public can understand what you're doing and be able to track the progress, and maybe even find out if they can contribute themselves, so that we can feel like we know what's happening and possibly can help, and watch and see progress.
Well, I think it gets back to a necessary city framing, that the real test is going to be an overall reduction on the visible manifestations, and it really transcends visible, the immediate manifestations of homelessness. That's the number on the streets. I think we have to define ourselves a bit in that number, recognizing, like anything else, any output has a number of inputs to get to that output, right? I mean, and so we want to decrease invisible homelessness, and literally the point in time count, regardless what people think about whether that is an accurate measure, right? Every January, I don't know that we have a better raw number that we can use in terms of that that ultimate output. I will say, I think the HRAP team has done a good job of developing the dashboard up to date. It's not, I don't think it's anywhere where people exactly want it to be, but I've watched pretty closely the last 100 days, like the energy is being put into data aggregation and presentation. I guess I get back to my original point. I don't mean to be unspecific, but I hear the presentations on them. I can visualize why this metric is important in terms of the overall goal. So it's all fine, right? I mean, but I think the biggest gap is that articulation of a reduction in unsheltered homelessness. That's where I put that at the top of the list, the top of the screen, and then again recognizing all these other inputs that are super important to drive that number. The other piece, and this is, I'm going to be candid, this is a tougher part for the city of Portland in the community of folks that service the population, but I want to put it on the table. I do believe, there's preventing homelessness from economic displacement. Those are folks that leave state penitentiaries. Those that leave hospitals, right? These are our inputs into the homeless population, economic, all of the above. There are the various tools that we deploy to prevent against each of those three, and then to help solve once homelessness occurs. We also have to talk about things like, where does enforcement play in your number of homelessness? It's very hard for the county even to think about enforcement as a part, one of the levers to address that population. I bring it up here because there's still a number that kills me a little bit every time I hear it. And that is 70% of the offers of shelter that are made by the city of Portland are turned down, right? And so not only does the enforcement piece, I think, is important to folks who live in the city of Portland, and they're frustrated or intimidated by, or sometimes victimized by, an encampment in front of their home or their business, but also just how do we get people to make decisions that are the right decisions for them, and what's the right combination of offers of services and saying no to other behaviors. That I don't think I don't think we can avoid those questions from a holistic perspective on at least the unsheltered aspect of homelessness. So those are around the edges, but I think it's that big output number is the biggest one that I'd like to see addressed.
Thank you. Thank you for answering the question. We're about at time now, and I know we've this is one of those things when we get into this questioning in politics, where regardless of where we land, I do want to say this has been a really respectful conversation. Really impressed with everyone, and thank you, Rene, for answering all of the questions. I'm sure some of the questions were answered in a way people really liked, and some answers are probably in ways where people were like, "Oh, I don't know about that." But this discussion and this type of a venue, this is so important, so that we can kind of continue this process as we get close to the election. So thank you all for the great questions. Thank you all for the engagement. Thanks for joining. Thank you, Rene Gonzalez, for joining us today and for giving us the opportunity to hear more about your positions. We will make sure that the recording is available following the session. But other than that, it's 1 o'clock. I hope you all had a good lunch and hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And more importantly, I hope everybody votes.
Thank you all. What a wonderful dialogue. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Have a great day, everyone.
You
Bye.
too.